At 11:32 in the morning on November 29, 1943, Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran knelt inside the tail section of a B-17 Flying Fortress named Ricky Tiki Tavi and watched German fighters swarm toward his bomber like angry hornets. He was 19 years old, a dairy farm boy from Wisconsin, and this was his first combat mission over Germany. The 8th Air Force had sent more than 300 B-17 bombers toward the German city of Bremen that morning. Their mission was simple: destroy the factories that fueled Hitler's war machine. But nothing about the mission itself was simple. German defenses around Bremen were some of the strongest in the entire Reich. By the time Moran's bomber formation reached the target, 6 American flying fortresses had already been shot down, and the worst fighting was still ahead. Moran's position on the bomber was the loneliest of all. The tail gunner sat alone at the very rear of the aircraft, perched on a narrow bicycle-style seat surrounded by glass and thin aluminum. 40 feet of fuselage separated him from the rest of the crew. If anything went wrong back there, he was on his own. His only companions were 2 .50 caliber machine guns and the German fighters trying to kill him. A B-17 Flying Fortress carried 10 men. The pilot and co-pilot sat in the cockpit guiding the aircraft. The navigator and bombardier worked in the nose. Behind them stood the flight engineer, operating the top turret. Farther back was the radio operator, seated behind the bomb bay. 2 waist gunners fired from open windows along the sides of the fuselage. Below the bomber hung the ball turret gunner, enclosed in a glass sphere beneath the aircraft. And then there was Moran, alone in the tail. The tail gunner's job was brutally simple: protect the bomber's most vulnerable direction. German pilots had learned early in the war that the safest way to attack a B-17 was from directly behind it. From that angle, only one man could fire back: the tail gunner. If the tail gunner was eliminated, the bomber became easy prey. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force was suffering catastrophic losses. 2 months earlier, a mission to Schweinfurt had ended in disaster. 60 flying fortresses were destroyed in a single day. 600 airmen killed or captured in a matter of hours. Bomber crews had a grim nickname for missions deep into Germany. They called them milk runs to hell. The mathematics of survival were unforgiving. A bomber crew had to complete 25 missions before they could return home. Statistical studies showed that the average crew survived only 15. Some bomber groups lost half their aircraft within a single month. Every mission felt like borrowed time. Eugene Moran had enlisted the day he turned 18. He grew up on a small dairy farm near Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, where long days of work built strong hands and steady nerves. He loved airplanes. As a boy, he had watched them pass overhead and imagined himself inside one. The Army Air Forces needed gunners more than pilots. Young men with sharp eyesight and fast reflexes. Farm boys who knew how to shoot. Moran volunteered. Gunnery training taught him to track fast-moving targets while compensating for wind, altitude, and the speed of his own aircraft. He learned to fire short bursts so the barrels would not overheat. He memorized the shapes of enemy aircraft: the narrow nose of a Messerschmitt Bf 109, the broad wings of a Focke-Wulf 190. At 2,000 yards, he could identify them instantly. But nothing in training prepared him for what combat actually felt like. At 24,000 feet, the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Frostbite could steal fingers or toes within minutes. The air was so thin that even small movements became exhausting. And German fighters attacked in relentless waves, firing 20mm cannon shells capable of ripping through aluminum like paper. Ricky Tiki Tavi had taken off earlier that morning from Snetterton Heath Airfield in England. It flew as part of the 96th Bomb Group. Their target was the industrial port city of Bremen, located along the Weser River. Shipyards, aircraft factories, submarine construction yards. One of the most heavily defended targets in Germany. The bombers crossed the North Sea in tight defensive formations known as combat boxes. Each aircraft positioned carefully so its guns overlapped with those of the bombers around it. In theory, the combined firepower created a wall of bullets that enemy fighters could not penetrate. In reality, the formations had their own dangers. When one bomber took a direct hit, it often damaged the aircraft flying beside it. As the American bombers approached Bremen, German anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Heavy flak batteries filled the sky with black explosions. The bombers could not evade. During the bombing run, they were forced to fly straight and level. Perfect targets. Shrapnel tore through wings and fuselages. Moran watched a B-17 ahead of them take a direct hit. The aircraft folded in half. Then it dropped silently toward the earth. A moment later, Ricky Tiki Tavi released its payload. 4,000 pounds of bombs fell away toward the factories below. Mission accomplished. Now they just had to survive the flight back to England. The bomber formation began turning toward home. Nearly 200 miles of hostile airspace lay between them and safety. That was when disaster struck. A burst of flak slammed into the No. 2 engine of Moran's bomber. The propeller began spinning uselessly. The aircraft immediately started losing speed. A damaged bomber falling behind the formation was almost always doomed. German fighters watched carefully for stragglers. A lone flying fortress without the protection of the group was an easy kill. Moran saw them coming. From below, Messerschmitt fighters climbed toward the bomber. From above, Focke-Wulf fighters dove toward it. Within seconds, Ricky Tiki Tavi was surrounded. The bomber was about to fight alone against overwhelming odds. And in the very back of the aircraft, Eugene Moran would be the first man they tried to kill. The first German fighters approached from the 6 o'clock low position, directly behind and beneath the bomber. Moran pressed his shoulders against the steel armor plate behind his seat and squeezed the triggers. His twin, .50 caliber machine guns roared to life. Bright streams of tracer rounds cut through the sky toward the approaching fighter. The German pilot broke away sharply and rolled out of the attack. But more fighters were already moving into position. They attacked in pairs. One fighter drew the gunner's attention. The other slipped into position for the killing shot. Moran swung his guns from target to target. Spent shell casings piled around his boots. The smell of hot gunpowder filled the cramped tail compartment. At 24,000 feet, the temperature inside the aircraft had fallen to 43 degrees below zero. Moran wore an electrically heated flight suit, but the cold still crept through. Ice crystals formed on his oxygen mask. His fingers slowly went numb. The machine guns grew hot from constant firing. The German pilots knew exactly how to destroy a flying fortress. First, knock out the engines. A bomber without engines could not keep up with its formation. Then eliminate the gunners. Once the defensive guns fell silent, the bomber was helpless. Finally, pour cannon fire into the fuselage until something vital failed. Moran heard the impacts before he felt them. Heavy cannon shells tore through the bomber's aluminum skin. The sound was like metal being ripped apart. Somewhere forward in the fuselage, one of the waist gunners stopped firing. Then the other. The intercom filled with broken fragments of voices and static. Moran could not tell who was speaking, or who was still alive. The bomber shuddered under repeated hits. But Moran kept firing. There was nothing else he could do. A Focke-Wulf fighter attacked from the 4 o'clock position. Moran swung the guns and fired. His tracers struck the fighter's wing. The aircraft exploded apart and spiraled downward, trailing smoke. His first confirmed kill. But there was no time to celebrate. Another burst of cannon fire tore into the tail. Moran felt something slam into his left arm. Then his right. Both arms had been hit. Blood soaked through his sleeves. The pain was immediate and blinding. But his hands still worked. He could still pull the triggers. More shells slammed into the tail section. The vertical stabilizer above him took several direct hits. Control cables snapped and whipped through the air. The entire tail assembly began vibrating violently. Something was terribly wrong with the aircraft. Moran glanced down at the parachute strapped to his chest. Every airman carried one. If the bomber went down, it was the only chance of survival. But Moran saw something that made his stomach drop. The silk canopy was full of holes. Cannon rounds had shredded it. If he bailed out, he would fall 4 miles to his death. The attacks continued. German fighters circled and dove again and again. Moran counted at least 15 aircraft attacking the crippled bomber. Ricky Tiki Tavi was losing altitude and speed with every minute. The remaining engines struggled desperately to keep it airborne. Somewhere far forward in the shattered fuselage, navigator Jesse Orson was still alive. He had been wounded but remained conscious. The pilot and co-pilot were dead at the controls. The flight engineer was dead. The radio operator was dead. The ball turret gunner was dead. The waist gunners were dead. Of the 10 men who had taken off from England that morning, only 2 were still breathing. Orson in the nose, Moran in the tail. 40 feet of shattered aircraft between them. Then another cannon shell struck something critical. The bomber lurched violently. A deep, grinding noise echoed through the airframe. The vibration grew worse, until Moran heard a sound he would remember for the rest of his life. The shriek of tearing aluminum. The scream of structural failure. Ricky Tiki Tavi was breaking apart. The fuselage split just forward of the tail. Moran watched in horror as the entire front half of the bomber tore away. The wings, the engines, the cockpit, the bodies of his crew, all of it tumbling toward the German countryside 4 miles below. And suddenly, Eugene Moran was falling with the tail of the bomber. Alone, at 24,000 feet. Without a working parachute, Eugene Moran was alone. The rest of the bomber had vanished into the clouds below, torn away in an instant of violence. What remained of Ricky Tiki Tavi was a severed tail section, spinning through the sky like a broken arrow. Inside that fragment of aluminum and steel sat a 19-year-old gunner with shattered arms, a ruined parachute, and 24,000 feet of empty air beneath him. The laws of physics were merciless. A human body falling through the atmosphere eventually reaches terminal velocity, roughly 120 miles per hour. But Moran was not falling alone. The tail section of a B-17 weighed several thousand pounds. It would fall far faster. He had perhaps 90 seconds to live. The wreckage tumbled violently through the sky. It spun end over end, throwing Moran against the metal walls of the cramped compartment. Pain exploded through his wounded arms as blood sprayed across the interior of the aircraft. The wind roared through the torn fuselage where the rest of the bomber had once been. Metal screamed. The world spun, and the ground rushed upward. Most men would have frozen in terror. Most would have curled into themselves and waited for the end. But Eugene Moran did something that defied every instinct of survival. He kept fighting. The German fighters were still nearby. They had seen the bomber explode and watched the tail section break away. Curious, several of them circled lower. Perhaps they wanted to confirm the kill. Perhaps they simply wanted to see the wreckage fall. Whatever the reason, they made a fatal mistake. They came within range of a wounded tail gunner who refused to die. Moran grabbed the handles of his machine guns. The spinning motion of the wreckage made aiming almost impossible. The violent forces slammed him into the seat, then hurled him toward the ceiling. His arms were bleeding. His parachute was useless. He was falling 4 miles toward certain death. And still he fired. Bright tracer rounds streaked wildly across the sky as the tail section rotated. German fighters scattered in confusion. None of them had ever seen anything like this. A man trapped in a falling wreck. Still shooting. Still fighting. Still alive. One Messerschmitt took several hits across its fuselage. The pilot broke away instantly and dove toward the ground, trailing smoke. The altimeter in the tail had been shattered during the explosion. But Moran could see the ground clearly now. Fields. Roads. Forests. A patchwork of German farmland rushing upward with terrifying speed. And then something unexpected happened. Something that would save his life. The broken tail section began to slow down. The massive vertical stabilizer and horizontal tail planes were still attached. Those surfaces caught the rushing air like crude wings. They created drag. Instead of plunging straight down, the wreckage began to glide. The spinning gradually slowed. The fall became almost controlled. Almost. Moran estimated the descent at roughly 100 feet per second. Still fast enough to kill him instantly on impact, but far slower than a human body in free fall. The stabilizers were buying him time. Seconds, maybe a minute. Enough time for him to keep firing whenever a German fighter ventured too close. The ground grew larger. 5,000 feet, 3,000, 1,000. The forest below filled his vision. Moran braced himself against the steel armor plate behind his seat. He wrapped his shattered arms around the ammunition boxes bolted to the floor. There was nothing else to hold, nothing else to do. The tail section smashed into the top of a pine tree at nearly 100 miles per hour. Branches snapped like matchsticks. The vertical stabilizer caught a trunk and tore away. The wreckage cartwheeled violently through the forest canopy. Aluminum fragments ripped free and scattered through the trees. Moran's head slammed into the steel framework above him. White light exploded across his vision. He felt ribs crack. Both arms bent at angles no human arm should ever bend. The tail section struck another tree, then another. Finally, it spun sideways and crashed into the frozen ground. And everything went quiet. Eugene Moran was still alive. Barely. He lay trapped in the wreckage, unable to move. Both forearms were shattered in multiple places. Bone protruded through torn flesh. His ribs were broken. Every breath sent stabbing pain through his chest. A wound on his head had torn away part of his skull, leaving a portion of his brain exposed to the freezing air. The crash site lay in a forest near the German town of Syke, about 15 miles south of Bremen. Enemy territory. German civilians and soldiers nearby had just watched American bombers destroy their city. Moran tried to move. His legs responded weakly. His arms were useless. The cold crept into his body. Without help, hypothermia would kill him within hours. With unimaginable effort, he dragged himself toward the opening where the tail had broken away from the rest of the aircraft. Each movement sent waves of agony through his broken body. Finally, he pulled himself onto the frozen ground. Above him stretched the gray winter sky of Germany. He had survived a 4-mile fall without a parachute. Only 3 men in the entire war would ever accomplish such a thing. But survival meant nothing if he bled to death in the snow. Voices echoed through the trees. German voices. Soldiers moving toward the crash site. They emerged from the forest with rifles raised. The soldiers surrounded the wreckage and stared in disbelief at the American airmen lying in the snow. One shouted orders. Another ran back toward the road to summon an officer. Moran could not resist. He could barely breathe. The soldiers searched him roughly, ignoring his screams as they handled his shattered arms. They found his dog tags, his rank insignia, his ruined parachute. For nearly an hour, they left him lying on the frozen ground while they examined the wreckage. Eventually, an officer arrived. He looked down at Moran's injuries and slowly shook his head. The American was clearly dying. But orders were orders. Captured airmen were to be interrogated. Dead men provided no intelligence. They loaded Moran onto a wooden farm cart. No stretcher, no blankets, no medical care. The cart bounced along frozen country roads. Every jolt sent new waves of agony through his broken ribs and arms. Blood had frozen into a dark crust around the wound on his skull. Consciousness faded in and out. Eventually, the cart stopped at a German military facility. Moran never knew exactly where. His vision blurred. He remembered being carried inside. He remembered the cold concrete floor beneath him. He remembered German voices discussing him as though he were already dead. No doctor came. No medic. No water. No bandages. No morphine. German medical supplies were scarce. They would not waste them on an enemy airman who was unlikely to survive. Moran lay on that floor for 2 days. Infection spread through his wounds. The exposed tissue of his skull began to swell. His shattered arms turned dark with gangrene. Without surgery, he would lose both limbs. Without treatment, the infection would spread to his blood. He had perhaps 48 hours to live. Some of the guards ignored him completely. Others watched with quiet sympathy. But none had the authority to help. German cities had been bombed for months. Hospitals were filled with German wounded. Enemy airmen were far down the list of priorities. On the 3rd day, he was transported again. Another cart. Another agonizing journey through the cold countryside. This time his destination was a prisoner of war hospital, a converted building where wounded Allied airmen were treated just well enough to survive. German doctors performed brutal triage. Prisoners with survivable injuries received treatment. Those beyond saving were simply left to die. Moran clearly belonged in the second category. But the hospital had something unexpected, something that would change his fate. Among the prisoners were 2 Serbian doctors, military physicians captured earlier on the Eastern Front. The Germans forced them to treat wounded Allied prisoners. They worked with almost no equipment, almost no medicine, almost no anesthesia. When they examined Moran, they understood immediately how bad his condition was. His skull was shattered. Both arms were destroyed. Infection had already begun to spread. Saving him would be nearly impossible. But they made a decision. They would try anyway. Not because anyone ordered them. Not because they had the tools. Simply because he was a wounded man. And they were doctors. The surgery lasted 7 hours. They worked with crude instruments designed for battlefield operations. There was almost no anesthesia. Only local numbing agents that barely dulled the pain. Moran drifted in and out of consciousness while they worked. They reset his broken bones using metal pins and wire. They cleaned infected tissue from his wounds. They removed fragments of shattered skull. And they carefully covered the exposed portion of his brain with whatever tissue they could save. When the operation finally ended, Moran was still alive. But survival was far from certain. The next days would determine whether the impossible rescue had truly succeeded. The Serbian doctors worked with almost nothing. No proper surgical theater. No modern equipment. No steady supply of medicine. What they had was skill, improvisation, and the stubborn refusal to let one more man die if there was any chance at all of saving him. They attached a crude metal plate over the wound in Moran's skull, primitive by modern standards, but enough to protect the exposed tissue and keep him alive. They splinted his shattered arms with rough wooden boards and wrapped them in strips of cloth torn from sheets. They cleaned what they could, cut away dead tissue, closed what wounds they could close. When the operation was finally over, they told him the truth. The next 72 hours would decide everything. If the infection kept spreading, he would die. If the swelling in his head worsened, he would die. If his body refused to heal, there was nothing more they could do. From that point on, Eugene Moran's survival depended almost entirely on his own will to keep breathing. The fever came the first night. His temperature climbed to 104 degrees. His body shook with violent chills, even as sweat poured from his skin. The Serbian doctors watched him as closely as their limited resources allowed. They changed the bandages, forced water between his cracked lips, pressed cool cloths against his burning face. They had almost no medicine to fight infection. That was the greatest danger in wartime hospitals. Not always the wound itself, but what came after. The bacteria, the poison moving invisibly through blood, the slow collapse of a body already destroyed by trauma. Antibiotics existed, but inside a German prisoner hospital, they were almost impossible to get. The doctors had cleaned Moran's wounds as best they could, but they both knew the truth. Now his immune system was fighting a war of its own. The second night was worse. Moran slipped into delirium. He called out for his mother. He shouted warnings to crewmates who were already dead. He relived the destruction of Ricky Tiki Tavi over and over again, his mind replaying the moment the bomber split apart and fell from the sky. The other wounded prisoners lying in the ward listened in silence. Some turned their heads toward him in the darkness. Others stared at the ceiling and wondered if he would live long enough to see morning. The Serbian doctors took turns sitting beside him. They had no morphine to spare, no miracle drugs, only their presence. Only whispered encouragement in broken English that he likely never heard. Only the simple human act of refusing to leave him alone while he suffered. Then, on the third morning, the fever broke. When Moran opened his eyes, the world looked different. Not safe, not painless, but real again. For the first time in days, he recognized the room around him, recognized the doctors, recognized that he was still alive. The infection had not killed him. His body had somehow won the fight that medicine could barely support. The doctors examined his wounds and found the first signs of healing. The tissue around the plate in his skull was beginning to close. The broken bones in his arms were starting to knit. Recovery would be long, possibly years. His body was badly damaged, but he was going to survive. Word spread through the hospital. The American who fell 4 miles without a parachute. The tail gunner who kept firing while his bomber tore itself apart around him. The boy who should have died a dozen times and somehow refused. German guards came to see him. Other prisoners asked to hear the story. Even some of the hospital staff seemed astonished by the sheer improbability of his survival. But survival did not mean freedom. The Serbian doctors had saved his life. They could not save him from becoming a prisoner. Once Moran was stable enough to travel, the Germans processed him with efficient indifference. Name, rank, serial number, service branch, unit. They photographed him for their records. In the image, he looked older than 19. His cheeks were hollow. His arms were wrapped in splints. His eyes had the empty, exhausted stare of someone who had already lived through too much. 6 weeks after the crash, he could walk again. Barely. His ribs still hurt with every breath. His arms remained weak and deformed. The metal plate in his skull gave him constant headaches. But he was alive, upright, and therefore useful to the German prison system. They moved him out. His first permanent destination was Stalag Luft 4 in Pomerania, a camp built specifically to hold captured Allied airmen. Barbed wire fences, wooden barracks, watchtowers with machine guns, mud in the thaw, ice in the cold. Thousands of American and British prisoners packed behind wire, waiting for a war to end. Some had been there for years. Others had arrived only days earlier. Pilots, bombardiers, navigators, gunners, men who had fallen from the sky all over Europe. Now they shared one fate: live behind fences until Germany collapsed, or they did. Inside the camp, Moran discovered something strange. A kind of society. Prisoners organized themselves into routines. They maintained military discipline as best they could. They built libraries from donated books, held classes in mathematics, languages, and navigation. Some men secretly assembled radios from scavenged parts so they could listen to the BBC. Others planned escape attempts that usually failed. The point was not always success. The point was resistance. Proof that captivity had not completely broken them. Food was scarce. Thin soup, black bread, occasional potatoes, sometimes turnips. When Red Cross parcels arrived, the camp briefly felt human again. When they didn't, men went hungry. Most prisoners lost 20 or 30 pounds. Some lost more. Moran's body continued to heal, but slowly. His arms regained partial use, though they would never be as strong as before. The headaches remained, and the nightmares never stopped. He was alive. He was surviving. But ahead of him stretched 17 months of captivity, and the worst part still hadn't come. In the summer of 1944, the Germans moved him again. The journey happened in a cattle car. 60 men packed together with almost no room to sit. No real sanitation. No food for days. The train rattled east through occupied territory while men leaned against each other in exhaustion, praying for the doors to open. That transfer led to another camp. Then another. Over the following months, Moran passed through 4 separate prisoner camps as the Germans shuffled Allied airmen across a shrinking empire under increasing pressure. Every move brought new hardship, new guards, new disease, new hunger, new uncertainty. But the most horrifying transfer came in the autumn of 1944. The prisoners later called it the hellship. German authorities decided to move several hundred Allied prisoners across the Baltic Sea. The vessel chosen for the task was an old freighter, never meant for human cargo. The guards herded the prisoners below deck into the hold, a dark, metal chamber with no real ventilation, almost no space, and one bucket to serve as a latrine. Moran descended into that darkness with roughly 200 other men. Then the hatch closed above them, and the nightmare began. The hold was completely black. Men could not see their own hands. They could only hear groaning, coughing, vomiting, the muffled prayers of men who knew they were trapped. Prisoners suffering from dysentery could not reach the bucket in time. The stench became unbearable within hours. The crossing lasted 4 days. Men died in that hold. Their bodies remained among the living because there was nowhere else to put them. Some prisoners lost their minds in the darkness. Some screamed. Some fought. Others simply stopped responding and had to be checked for signs of life. When the hatch finally opened, Moran climbed into gray daylight with eyes that had almost forgotten what light looked like. His clothes were soaked in filth. His body had shed more weight it could not afford to lose. The metal plate in his skull throbbed with pain that never fully left him. The hellship delivered its surviving prisoners to another camp in East Prussia. More wire, more towers, more thin soup and black bread, more waiting. But by then, the war was changing. By January 1945, Soviet forces were driving westward. Allied armies were pushing from the opposite direction. Germany was being crushed between 2 massive fronts. The prisoners could hear distant artillery now, could see something new in the faces of their guards. Nervousness, fear, the sense that the old certainties were collapsing. On February 6, 1945, the order came. The camp was to be evacuated immediately. The Soviets were approaching. All prisoners would march west on foot. Destination unknown. Distance unknown. Refusal meant death. The men assembled in the frozen compound. The temperature had dropped to nearly 20 below zero. Many of the prisoners had no proper winter clothing. No gloves. No insulated boots. They had been half-starved for months. And now they were expected to walk across Germany in one of the harshest winters of the war. The column stretched for miles. Thousands of Allied airmen trudging through ice and snow, while German guards marched beside them with rifles ready. The rules were simple. Anyone who fell too far behind would be shot. Anyone who tried to escape would be shot. Walk or die. Moran had survived a 4-mile fall, survived catastrophic injuries, survived infection, survived the hellship. Now he faced hundreds of miles of frozen road with a body that had never fully healed. The march would later become known as the Black March, and it would test him in ways even the sky over Bremen never had. What followed became one of the longest forced marches endured by Allied prisoners in Europe. For 86 days, thousands of captured airmen were driven across Germany in brutal winter conditions. They walked through blizzards and freezing rain. They slept in barns filled with animal waste. They drank from roadside ditches polluted with sewage. They survived on whatever scraps of food they could steal or scavenge from ruined villages. Historians would later estimate that more than 1,500 American and British prisoners died during the march. Some from pneumonia, some from dysentery, some from typhus or frostbite that turned to gangrene. Others from the bullets of guards who decided a man too weak to continue was not worth waiting for. Eugene Moran simply kept walking. Behind him were 17 months of captivity. Ahead of him stretched an unknown distance through a collapsing Germany. And somewhere beyond that, if he could endure long enough, was freedom. The march pushed forward through February and March of 1945. Each day the prisoners walked between 15 and 20 miles through snow that sometimes reached their knees. At night they collapsed inside freezing barns or slept on open ground beneath the winter sky. Food was almost non-existent. Men dug raw potatoes from frozen fields. They melted snow in tin cups because the streams were too contaminated to drink safely. Every step was an act of survival. For Moran, the march was torture. His arms had healed badly and throbbed with pain in the cold. The metal plate in his skull seemed to conduct the freezing air straight into his head. His ribs, never fully healed after the crash, ached with every breath. The body that had survived a 4-mile fall was now struggling simply to keep moving forward. Men died around him every day. Some collapsed silently into the snow and never rose again. Others developed fevers that consumed them within hours. Guards sometimes shot prisoners who fell behind. The long column left a grim trail across the countryside. Bodies in ditches, bodies in fields, bodies beside frozen roads. A map of suffering stretching across Germany. But Moran refused to stop. He had not survived a fall from 24,000 feet only to die on a frozen road. He had not endured surgery without anesthesia, infection, prison camps, and the hellship to surrender now. The same stubborn determination that had kept him firing his guns as his bomber disintegrated kept him moving forward step by step. By April 1945, the prisoners had marched nearly 500 miles. And something new was happening. They could hear artillery in the distance. Every day it grew louder. American and British armies were closing in from the west. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. Germany was collapsing. Liberation was coming. On April 26, 1945, the march finally ended. Near the Elbe River, soldiers from the 104th Infantry Division of the United States Army intercepted the column. The German guards dropped their weapons and surrendered. For a moment, the prisoners simply stood there in silence. After years behind barbed wire, after months marching through snow and death, they could barely comprehend that it was over. They were free. Eugene Moran weighed 93 pounds. When he had entered the Army Air Forces, he weighed 150. The crash, the surgeries, the prison camps, the hellship, and the Black March had stripped away nearly 40% of his body weight. He looked like a skeleton wrapped in skin. But he was alive. American medical teams rushed to treat the liberated prisoners. Many required immediate hospitalization. Typhus had spread through the marching column. Pneumonia was common. Frostbite had destroyed fingers and toes that would later need amputation. Doctors worked around the clock to stabilize men who had been starved and abused for months or years. When the Army reviewed Moran's record, even hardened officers were astonished. His file read like something impossible. Shot down over Bremen on November 29, 1943. Aircraft destroyed by enemy action. Fell from 24,000 feet inside the tail section of a destroyed bomber. Parachute destroyed. Survived the impact. Captured and held prisoner for 17 months. Endured the Black March across Germany. Still alive. Military historians would later confirm that only 3 Allied airmen in the entire war survived falls of comparable distance without parachutes. In each case, wreckage from the destroyed aircraft slowed their descent enough to make survival barely possible. All 3 were considered miracles. Eugene Moran was one of them. The Army awarded him 2 Purple Hearts for the wounds he received during the attack on his bomber, one for each arm shattered by German cannon fire. He received the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster for his service with the 8th Air Force. He was also awarded the European Theater Medal and the Good Conduct Medal. On December 1, 1945, he received an honorable discharge from the United States Army Air Forces. The 96th Bomb Group, the unit Moran had served with, suffered enormous losses during the war. 938 of its men were killed, 206 aircraft destroyed, thousands of missions flown over the most heavily defended targets in Europe. Against those grim statistics, Moran's survival was almost impossible. News of his fall had circulated even during the war. Allied radio operators intercepted German broadcasts describing an American airman who had fallen 4 miles and lived. Those reports eventually reached Wisconsin. For months, Moran's family did not know whether the story referred to him. Letters arrived repeating fragments of the rumor. Hope mixed with uncertainty until official confirmation finally reached them. Their son was alive. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran returned home to Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, in late 1945. The farm boy who once watched airplanes overhead and dreamed of flying. The tail gunner who fell from the sky and refused to die. He was only 21 years old, but the war had aged him far beyond his years. A few months after returning home, Moran married Margaret Finley, a local woman who had known him before the war. She saw beyond the scars and the nightmares that sometimes woke him screaming in the middle of the night. She saw the man who had survived everything. Together they built a quiet life on a small farm near Soldiers Grove. They raised 9 children. Moran worked the land, attended church on Sundays, and watched his grandchildren grow. He rarely spoke about the war. Not to his wife. Not to his children. Not to curious neighbors. Too many friends had died. 8 of the 10 men aboard Ricky Tiki Tavi never came home. Talking about it meant reliving it. So he stayed silent for more than 60 years. The physical wounds never truly disappeared. The metal plate in his skull caused headaches for the rest of his life. His arms remained weak and painful in cold weather. His ribs ached whenever storms approached. His body carried the memory of November 29, 1943 until his final day. But he lived. He raised his family. He watched the world move into a new century. The farm boy who should have died a dozen times lived long enough to see the 21st century begin. In 2007, more than 60 years after the war, the Wisconsin Board of Veterans Affairs created a new honor, the Veteran Lifetime Achievement Award. They chose Eugene Moran as the very first recipient. At last, officially, his state recognized what he had endured. Journalists began telling his story. Historians documented his experience. A local teacher named John Armbruster spent years interviewing Moran and researching the details. His work eventually became the book, Tailspin, published in 2022. On October 18, 2008, the town of Soldiers Grove honored Moran in another way. They named a street Eugene Moran Way, a permanent reminder in the town where he was born and where he spent the rest of his life. The other surviving member of Ricky Tiki Tavi also returned home. Navigator Jesse Orison had managed to bail out from the front of the aircraft before it broke apart. He spent the rest of the war in captivity like thousands of other Allied airmen. His testimony later confirmed Moran's account of the mission over Bremen. Eugene Moran died on March 23, 2014. He was 89 years old. 7 decades had passed since the day his bomber was cut in half above Germany. 7 decades since he kept firing his machine guns while the sky spun around him. 7 decades since Serbian doctors saved his life with improvised tools and extraordinary courage. Moran once summed up his philosophy with a simple sentence: "I would rather wear out than rust out." It was the mindset of a man who never surrendered. Not to the Germans. Not to his wounds. Not to the endless march through winter. And not to the silence that followed the war. The tail gunner position on a B-17 was the loneliest spot on the aircraft. Separated from the crew. The first target for enemy fighters. The last to know if the bomber was going down. On November 29, 1943, Eugene Moran sat in that seat. And when his aircraft disintegrated around him, he did not curl up and wait for death. He kept shooting all the way down.